You're listening to the Greeks Gridiron, live with Ethan Haristodoulou.
Welcome back, everybody, to more of the Greeks Gridiron and to another edition of This Week in the USFL. So good morning or good afternoon to my USFL fans. Today, we are diving into the 13 new players that have made either NFL rosters or practice squads following the cut down to the 53-man rosters of the NFL teams as NFL preseason has completely wrapped up, and we're getting ourselves ready now for the regular season to kick off in just a mere 6 days. So sit back and we'll discuss. I'll break down first the guys that are on the active rosters. We'll go over the 11 players that have made their way to the practice squads, and I'll even highlight some guys that I think have a good shot of maybe finding themselves getting elevated at some point within the season. But beginning first with the numbers. So, like I said, 13 total players making it to the NFL. That's not including the guys from last year as well. I believe if you count the people that made it from the USFL to NFL last season, we're looking at about 25 players or so, give or take, representing the USFL in the NFL. But for this 13 that we are talking about today, 6 of them are Birmingham Stallions, 4 of them being Michigan Panthers. We have a Houston Gambler, a Memphis Showboat, and a Philadelphia Star to round out that group of 13. And like I said, 2 of those guys making the active 53-man rosters. First guy we're going to highlight here is, of course, the kicker, Brandon Aubry, formerly of the Birmingham Stallions, being officially named the starting kicker for those Dallas Cowboys to start the season. To wrap up the preseason, Aubry went 4 for 4 on extra points in the Cowboys' 31-16 win over the Las Vegas Raiders. He also was 1 for 2 on field goal attempts. He missed an early 59-yarder in the first quarter, but later on in the game, towards the end of the fourth quarter, he was given an opportunity again to make up for that miss, and he was absolute nails, banging it through from another 59-yard attempt. The Cowboys, obviously being no stranger to USFL talent, they brought in Kavonte Turpin from last season's USFL year, where he was the MVP of the season and earning himself All-Pro honors in the NFL season following that. So no stranger to USFL talent, and I'm excited to see how Brandon Aubry fares working his way through the 2023 season of the NFL. The second player we're going to highlight here is none other than defensive tackle of the Philadelphia Stars, LeBron Ray, who made the 53-man roster of the Carolina Panthers. He's currently listed as the defensive tackle for the team. He's going to be playing behind Derek Brown and is one of only 5 interior defensive linemen on the 53-man roster. So he made himself a pretty small group, which is exciting to see for him. Ray finished the 2023 USFL season with 8 tackles and 3 sacks on the year, and he had himself a pretty decent preseason for the Panthers himself. But at 6'5", 285 pounds, the former Alabama interior D lineman brings size and an ability to not only collapse the pocket, but also bring pressure from inside and bring down the quarterback. A nice backup addition to the Panthers. Again, this was one of those guys that, while he did look good this past season in the USFL, wasn't necessarily sure what was going to happen just considering the players that they had on the roster going through the preseason for the Carolina Panthers, but hats off to him. He made the roster, proved some doubters wrong, and is only one of 2 guys who have made a 53-man active roster from the USFL. Now, looking in at the practice squad here, we're talking 11 players altogether, and so I'll just kind of run through the list, and then I'm going to highlight some of the guys that I'm actually really excited for because I think that there's a good opportunity for them to actually make their way onto an active roster spot maybe at some point in the season. We're looking at Austin Watkins Jr. and Lorenzo Brown signing on with the Cleveland Browns practice squad. Then we're looking at Alex Magoo making the practice squad of the Green Bay Packers. We have Kaden Davis, who's on the Arizona Cardinals practice squad. Levi Bell made it for the Seahawks. Cornerback Josh Butler is on the Cowboys. Wide receiver DJ Montgomery signed on with the Indianapolis Colts. Nehemiah Shelton is signing on with the Jets. Josh Peterson sticking around, the tight end, son of the head coach of the Jacksonville Jaguars. He's going to be hanging out there for at least the beginning of this season. We have defensive tackle Khalil Davis signing on with the Texans practice squad. And then we got cornerback Mac Hankins, who signed on with the Los Angeles Chargers. Now, like I said, there are some notable guys here that I want to highlight because these are people that I think we're probably going to at some point see get some game action this season. And the first person I'm going to highlight here, and I don't really think this is going to be a surprise to anyone, has got to be wide receiver Austin Watkins, who had himself an unbelievable preseason, and myself included on this, lots of people shouting to the rooftops as to why he didn't end up cracking the 53-man roster, but ultimately he signs on with the Cleveland Browns. He had 16 total catches, 257 yards, and a couple of touchdowns, but the thing that really stood out to me was his per reception average of over 16 yards a catch. When you look at the Browns wide receiver room right now, they currently have 6 guys on the roster, and if there's anyone that I could see him maybe taking a step over, depending on how their playmaking ability, turns out for the group as like wide receiver 5 or 6, because this is what I've talked about a lot in regards to Austin Watkins. You look at a guy like Marquise Goodwin, who was dealing with some blood clotting issues, and he was gone for a significant amount of time from the team. Depending on how all of that has kind of impacted him, maybe he starts out slow, maybe he comes right back in the fold, and he's as good as before, and all is behind him. We don't necessarily know, but that'll be a player to watch. And also wide receiver David Bell that the Browns drafted in last year's draft in the 3rd round. Also someone to keep an eye on there. Again, one of only 6 guys to have made the roster. I think the other 4 in front of them are probably locked in for, at the very least, this season, barring some unforeseen meltdown by either of the 4 guys ahead of them. But definitely a possibility with the production he had that if they're not quite getting anything out of those other guys, or just not making the plays that are necessary when their numbers are called on, maybe we get to see some Austin Watkins this season. The second guy I'm highlighting here is actually going to be probably a surprise, but one that I think is worth mentioning here, defensive tackle Khalil Davis. There's only 4 defensive tackles right now on the Houston Texans active roster, and he had himself a pretty solid preseason with 5 tackles and a sack. Now, the reason I'm bringing him up here is because with the new head coach over there, they're kind of working through a lot of changes in Houston, and I think a lot is up in the air, especially when you look at some of the depth positions. Maybe your starters are kind of set in stone, but beyond that, with a new regime coming in and making some massive changes to a Texans team that has been very much in flux for the last few years, this is a guy that I think is a prime candidate, depending on how the depth plays out and if they're not quite getting what they need from them. This is someone who I would honestly, out of all the 5 guys on here, I would probably be surprised the least if he wound up getting some playing time this season, just because I'm sure there's going to be, especially with 3 weeks of preseason now, we're looking at 3 instead of 4, you get even less time to evaluate. And with a new coaching regime in there, you're going to need more time to really figure out what you've got. I don't think that just a training camp and 3 games of preseason really allows you to figure out what you have. So to see Khalil Davis hang on to that practice squad spot, there's a good opportunity that maybe he gets some playing time if the Texans wind up not being satisfied with some of their depth interior defensive linemen. Third guy that I'm going to highlight here, and someone that I honestly wasn't expecting to be talking about over Davian Davis, but here we are, Kaden Davis, clinging on to a practice squad spot with the Arizona Cardinals. They're carrying only 5 wide receivers on their active roster right now, and Kaden Davis had himself a solid preseason. He finished off with 6 receptions for 57 yards. He was averaging about 9.5 yards per reception. You're pretty much looking at 5 guys on a wide receiver room that's fairly thin considering what I would expect their offense to look like. They're not a super heavy tight end set type of team, and I think that with all the conversation regarding like, oh, the Cardinals are tanking and, it seems like they're throwing the season away. This is a year where I think they're going to get away with a lot of like in-season evaluation, and I would not be surprised. This is like probably like your second most likely guy, in my opinion, out of the 5 I'm talking about here, that winds up seeing some playing time, just because if the tanking thing is to be believed, in a season like that, there is going to be a point where guys are going to either be traded or let go, and you're going to see some guys get an opportunity to maybe prove themselves. And with Kaden Davis being so young and having a solid showing in the preseason, even if it's like the back half of the year following the trade deadline, maybe like weeks like 12 and beyond, if Kaden Davis is getting snaps and making a few plays here or there, would not be surprised to be talking about it come that time. Fourth guy on my list here, someone that I'm happy to see make the Seahawks practice squad, and that is going to be edge rusher Levi Bell. Currently, Seahawks have only 5 edge rushers on their active roster, and with Levi Bell finishing with a pretty strong week 3 in the preseason with 4 tackles, and he also had himself another tackle and a sack earlier in the preseason. This is one that makes a lot of sense to me. He was very effective this past season in the USFL, and the Seahawks, I'm not really surprised he didn't wind up making the final 53, because the 5 guys they currently have on their roster are bona fide dudes that I have a really hard time, justifying Levi Bell going over any of them. But for him to latch on after having a solid showing in the preseason and just seeing how productive he was in this past season for the USFL, it's no surprise to me that he's there. I don't necessarily know if we're probably going to end up seeing him or not this year. Best case scenario for him would be like an injury happens and he gets elevated to the active roster. Obviously, you don't want to see anyone get hurt, but that's probably the most likely development to lead to him ending up on the active roster at some point in the season. Because again, those 5 guys they have on their group, or on their roster rather, are just, it's very deep. They're very talented players, and it's going to be tough to try to find yourself some playing time for any other reason other than like someone goes down with an injury, and Levi Bell being able to spend time in the system and learn on the practice squad would be the right choice to elevate should anything like that come to head. And for the final guy that I'm highlighting here, this is one that hits home for me personally as a Colts fan, wide receiver DJ Montgomery, who had himself a pretty solid preseason with 5 receptions for 75 yards, averaging a whopping 15 yards per reception. The Colts wide receiver room is very much up in the air right now. There is a lot of conversation as to what's going on there, because at one point they literally had only 3 wide receivers. Now we're sitting at 4, and there is a possibility that they end up running some very heavy tight end sets, especially with the way this offense is probably going to mold around Anthony Richardson. But for them to only have 4 wide receivers on the active roster really limits just the amount of like shotgun 4 or 5 wide receiver sets. So you can't even technically run a 5 wide receiver set. You'd have to have a tight end or a running back in to replace them, which happens frequently. But if you want to run like a true empty set with 5 wide receivers, you don't have that option in Indianapolis. Now, DJ Montgomery, standing at 6'1", solid size, solid athleticism, could be a guy that at some point, depending on how things shape up with the way this offense is going to look, because we really don't know. It's a first-year head coach in Shane Steichen. We got a rookie quarterback as well. It's going to take some time for them to figure out what their true strengths and weaknesses are. And if the Colts find that they're getting more success out of running more empty sets or just out of the shotgun in general more, despite the fact that Anthony Richardson was a guy who played a ton under center while he was in college, I would not be shocked to see him get elevated being in their system. If come, midpoint of the season, they're still trying to sort some things out and maybe they move away from heavy tight end sets because they have a lot of good tight ends in Indianapolis. Would not surprise me at all if he winds up getting elevated after spending some time in their system here, especially with that 15 yards per catch average. That's got to be something that's sitting in the back of the mind of the head coaching or just the coaching staff as a whole. That, if you're maybe not getting the results out of your wide receiver room that you'd like, I know it's very easy to just go and sign a free agent, but if you have a guy like Montgomery who was making some solid plays in the preseason, why not dip in and see with what you have? You probably save yourself some money as well. I feel like elevating Montgomery probably going to be a lot cheaper than bringing in like a veteran option or something like that from free agency, especially when you have to pay them more money and bring them in and catch them up to speed when you have a guy who's kind of waiting in the wings already for you. But that is this week in the USFL. A lot to discuss as we move into the regular season. I'm going to be covering, of course, anything that has to do with plays made by some of these guys. I will be highlighting literally anything. If a USFL player from even last season, doesn't have to be these 13 guys we're talking here. If it's people from last season who are still currently on active rosters, if they're making plays and they're doing things on Sunday, I will be sure to highlight them to you all week in and week out. Will not miss it. I promise that to you, my USFL fans. I'm going to have content for you riding the entirety of the USFL offseason. So with that, I appreciate it if you made it to the end of the video. I will see you all next time. Have a good one.